Welcome back to Plato's Dialogues. I'm here with AP the hairiest and NP the handsomest. So we're here to talk about some more issues, and I just wanted to start off today, bro, by talking about something a long time ago, going way back in my history to when I first started teaching.
About the same in my history, maybe?
About the same, maybe. I'm 11 minutes advanced from your history because I was born 11 minutes before you. So 18 years ago, I started teaching at a Protestant school, and from that moment until now, every year there's been two questions that have been asked to me as a teacher, and they're both ethical questions. The first one was always about Nazis. If Nazis come to your door and there's Jews inside, is it okay to lie to the Nazis? So I'm not going to go into that right now, but that's one of them, and I always call you yearly. You know I'm going to call you up about that.
Yeah. The Nazi conversation.
The Nazi conversation, exactly. Although I do know the priest that gave me the best answer was, if you have a sawed-off shotgun, that was the time to use it. Yeah. That was his answer to that question. But that wasn't yours. But I want to ask you about the A-bomb, because this also has come up, because when I first started teaching, I actually was a good Christian. I was thoughtful, I was devotional, I had a personal relationship with Christ in the Protestant sense, and really dedicated my life to that. And I felt like I was consistent. But I actually believe the A-bomb was okay, it was justified. And it was for all the reasons you've heard before. All you viewers have probably heard this argument that it was necessary to use the A-bomb because we had to end the war. It was the only way to end the war. And it would save lives. That was the argument given. Right. And I thought about that, and I actually believed that was a good argument, which I think now was inconsistent. And I remember you bringing that up and teaching me a little bit about the view of Anscombe and this letter that she wrote, or article to Mr. Truman, Mr. Truman's degree, I think it was. Anyway, I don't want to go into that as much. You can mention it if you want, but I want to get into a conversation about ethics and how to think about this. Because honestly, if I as a Christian had that problem, and I was thoughtful, philosophical. And I've also experienced that problem 18 years now in the school I'm teaching at now. A good Catholic, that is a good Catholic family, 6 kids, also believed that the A-bomb was justified, gave the same argument. So we need to think about this more if we're going to move forward in our society and really found the kingdom of Christ and the good Christian kingdom. I think we need that conversation. So that's what I want to talk about today. So go for it. What do you got?
Well, Anscombe wrote that. Actually, it was a speech she gave when Oxford University decided they were going to give Harry Truman an honorary degree for his heroic decision to murder thousands of people. And Anscombe, her basic argument was, well, mass murderers don't deserve honorary degrees. That doesn't make sense, so we shouldn't give him this degree.
It's a pretty decent argument.
Yeah, and so with that, she stood against all the Oxford dons at that time. There was a couple other women philosophers with her that stood. And the vote, their position totally failed. So he was given the honorary degree. But the position that she defended was a position of traditional morality, that the ends don't justify the means, that there are certain actions that they're intrinsically unjust, like, for example, intentionally killing innocent people, and that nothing can authorize that. Nobody can authorize that. And so even though the end might be saving lives, which is actually questionable, that doesn't justify that action. And so the thought that it's necessary often is a sort of trumping move.
Absolutely, that's what happened with me. That's the same thing with this guy I talked to all the way back 18 years. Same thing.
But that gets us to a really important question that I think Anscombe highlighted in one of her most famous essays. I'd say the most famous essay in ethics in the 20th century in analytic philosophy, called Modern Moral Philosophy. And she asked that question at the end, which is it ever necessary to do an injustice? Is it ever the best thing to do an injustice?
That's interesting, just to interrupt real quick, because this year, I just got done with the school year, the COVID year, which was interesting. Some of it was online, which was pretty awful, but we're still able to do education. I did half of the Republic in person, and half of the Republic online. But so this topic is obviously relevant in terms of injustice and justice, and there are different categories to think with. But so she asked.
I think of that as an ancient philosophical question of profound importance. Right? Because what it does is it presupposes there's some relationship between justice and the good. So we presuppose, as part of the Christian view and the Western view more generally, that the just man is the good man. That you can't be a good person unless you're just. And that if you do anything unjust, it's evil, it's bad, it's wrong.
So let's get into this, because I wanted to make sure this conversation went to these. I heard you talking this with Jacob before. I've heard you talking with other people. You've talked to me about this on the phone one time, but I'm kind of fuzzy on it, to tell you the truth. The 5 characters.
So at that moment in the essay, she says, hey, since we can rule out Kant and Mill and Hume, right, and all these modern philosophers, and that Aristotle doesn't really have a theory that can answer the question, then we can raise this question. It's a live question now.
The question,
the ancient question, whether it's ever necessary or best to do an injustice. And she says there's 5 different characters that respond to that. And those characters, in a certain way, represent viewpoints that are live viewpoints today that we share, right, or people can hold. So we can walk through those if you want.
I definitely want to do that. I'm actually ready to take a couple notes because honestly, I want to know a little bit better.
All right.
And I think the viewers will literally appreciate this. And it helped me when I first listened to you say this on the phone, understand myself and society, because it gave me tools, conceptual tools, that I think are helpful.
What I'm going to do is I'm not just going to be following Anscombe here. I'm going to give you her characters, but then I'm going to take it a step further to where I think it needs to go. But the characters, let me just tell you what those are. The first character, I call him the classical philosopher. So he responds and says, no, it's never best or it's never necessary to do an injustice. And they describe this sort of theory of virtue to justify
Plato,
Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, their kind of theoretical response.
I can connect with that.
Yeah, but Anscombe quickly qualifies and says, well, we can use that language, the jargon of virtue theory, but because we don't have the conceptual tools anymore, because of the breakdown of philosophy, right, we can't actually have that theory. But you can talk like that, and you can answer, and that's a legitimate answer. But it's not the only legitimate answer. So the next character, right, is another type of legitimate answer, and he's the guy that says, well, I'm not that impressed with your theory, classical philosopher. And I think, you know what, every once in a while, it is necessary to do what's unjust. So think of this as kind of the Jack Bauer figure. So he knows, he knows that what he does is wrong and it goes against his conscience, but he knowingly violates his conscience. And so therefore, what happens after he does the injustice, which he believes is best, he doesn't want any praise. He doesn't want any honor because he knows he's evil in doing that. But he thinks this is necessary. Now think for a second about the cosmology or theology behind that view. He thinks that this world is such that maybe you have to do something evil.
It's very tragic.
Yes, it's a tragic view of the cosmos. Think of the Greek tragedians.
Yeah, that's exactly what I first thought of. That's so tragic. I actually thought of, I just read Turin in the Silmarillion, and how tragic that story is, like everything he did, he felt like he had to do, but it caused damage and was a problem. It's not necessarily the same as Jack Bauer, but it was so tragic. I see the comparison. Yeah, so sad.
So that guy, I call him the hard-nosed realist. So maybe we could call him an exceptionalist. He thinks that there's certain crazy, catastrophic circumstances where he's got to violate his conscience and do evil. And the third character is what we might call him the sane and honest man, the plain person, sort of the person of common decency. What he says when asked that question, should you ever do what's unjust? He says, it's disgraceful even to think about doing injustice. So he doesn't even respond with a direct no because he thinks imagining himself doing injustice is just despicable and wrong already. So he has some really good conscience. It's sensitive, right? And then the fourth character is the generically religious man. I say generically religious because when Anscombe describes him, he says it's anybody who believes in a divine law. And their answer is no, absolutely, you should never do what's unjust because it can't profit anybody to break God's laws. You might not understand how it is in the end the best, but you can never go against God's laws. That's stupid, right? That's insane. So that might be a Jew, that might be a Stoic. This is Anscombe's example. Might be a Christian. That's why I say generically religious. It's not attached to a particular religion.
What's interesting to me, as someone I think that is not an academic, and not a professional academic, is those 1, 3, and 4 to me seem pretty reasonable. To hold. 2 I can say no because he's actually doing the evil. And the other ones seem like they're avoiding the evil. And
that's right. Good. The 3 avoid it and the 1 doesn't.
So if I told this to my students, I think they would all, so far, I know you have more to the story with the 5th guy, is that it seems like those are fine. What's wrong with those? But anyway,
so I'm going to get to what's wrong. And that's where I'm going to go beyond what Anscombe did there. But the 5th character, she says, is the man who thinks that what's best in the circumstances is good, because it creates the best end, the best consequences, right? So whenever you think in any circumstances, whatever produces the best balance of good and evil, that means your action's also good. And so this character thinks that because it was necessary and because it was best, the act was virtuous. So doing injustice, weirdly, can be virtuous on this viewpoint. That's why she calls him the corrupt-minded man. The way he thinks about that issue, the assumption behind the question, which is the relationship of justice and goodness. He completely scrambles things up into a crazy way.
Yeah.
So he doesn't violate his conscience because his conscience is deformed.
Is already messed up.
So she says, totally boot him off the island. Let's reject him. He's the corrupt-minded mind.
Okay.
He's the consequentialist. He thinks sometimes it might be good and virtuous to intentionally kill an innocent person. In fact, to arrest, right, condemn, and execute an innocent person if it's for the greater good.
That's crazy to me.
Yes.
That seems obviously wrong.
Yes, so she boots him off the island, and she leaves these four,
Okay.
which modern moral philosophers then have to try to sort out.
Okay.
But because she's already ruled out Kantian theory, Mill's utilitarianism,
As quick as and hopelessly academic can give me.
Okay.
What is the definition of utilitarianism?
that is a good question, because when I say consequentialism and utilitarianism, those sound like the same thing.
Yes.
Well, here's the thing, is utilitarianism actually comes in two kinds.
Okay.
Right? There's act utilitarianism and there's rule utilitarianism. I'll get to that in a second, but what is utilitarianism generically?
Yeah, that starts there.
It's the idea that the principle of utility, which is a rational rule, is how we measure whether an action's right or wrong. And utility has to do with whether it gets you pleasure and helps you avoid pain.
Give me an
roughly
example of
speaking.
that in general. Can you give me an example of a utilitarian thinking according to utilitarian philosophy?
Yes.
Like you just.
Yes. So if I want to know whether or not it's the best for, if it's the best for society to allow abortion, right? Does that make for the greatest happiness for the greatest number?
Okay. So greatest. I've heard that.
That's the rule of utility.
Okay.
The greatest happiness for the greatest number.
All right.
Happiness being defined in terms of pleasure.
Right.
Not a Greek concept of flourishing and has to do with your nature operating rightly.
Or
Not that
unfolding
kind.
or whatever.
No.
So
It just has to do with pleasure and pain.
Okay. And I also think of this in terms of the euthanasia stuff.
Yes.
Is that we have to, at some point, older people that are like sucking up the economic,
Yes.
wealth or resources.
Yes.
More people could be more happy if they had more of those resources, so it's okay to kill old
Yes.
people.
Yes.
Yeah, that's utilitarian.
That's right. Now,
Okay.
if we're asking whether an individual action can be justified as right by the principle of utility, that's called act utilitarianism.
Okay.
But the act utilitarianism actually just is consequentialism.
Okay.
Rule utilitarianism, right, is when you're asking whether or not, let's say, the rule or the law to have, like thou shalt not murder, whether the state should make that a law. For example, if you're asking whether a law or rule can be justified by the principle of utility, then you're a rule utilitarian.
Okay.
So the thing is, Mill, my interpretation of him, is Mill was a rule utilitarian. Okay, so he was not a consequentialist.
So laws should be made based on this
Yes,
rule.
because he tried to defend the traditional moral prohibitions on murder, theft, those sort of adultery, those actions that we
Second
think of as
table.
intrinsically wrong actions. He tried to defend those as rules. But the problem is his position is wobbly.
Okay.
And so actually I think if you investigate him and scrutinize him, his position is either inconsistent, right? Falls back to an Aristotelianism, which has its own problem, or you just have to make it act utilitarian, which is consequentialist.
Okay.
And consequentialism, I want to add the key feature of it that Anscombe identified that I think we should all pay attention to is consequentialism denies that there are any actions that are intrinsically wrong and unjust. Any action, if you put it in the right circumstances and it creates the right sort of consequences, it can be right, it can be good.
Okay. Okay. So all those guys that you just mentioned.
Yes. She rejects them.
Okay.
I don't want to go into that argument because that's a long time, but suppose we do reject that. Yeah.
Good call, bro.
I'm learning from you.
Thank you.
I'm learning.
You need to learn more from me.
Yeah, I'll try.
Yeah.
So we've got these four positions left.
All right.
Right, and you're right that most of us think about the Jack Bauer figure as we don't praise him, but he doesn't want praise, remember?
Right.
So his conscience is not deformed yet.
Okay.
Now, it is possible that Harry Truman was there when he decided to drop that bomb. He might have been violating his conscience. But the problem with Harry Truman is he accepted many honors. You can look at the history.
Yeah, I was going to say later he actually was proud of his decision.
Exactly, he was proud, he accepted
I just
honors.
know some of the
So the
history
most
about
charitable read I can give of Harry Truman is in the beginning he was like a Jack Bauer person,
Okay.
but then he became corrupt-minded. His conscience was formed and then it got deformed by accepting praise.
Okay.
Whereas Jack Bauer, right, he'll eventually get, deformed in his conscience, but he constantly is saying, no, don't praise me, I'm not a good man, it was just necessary. Somebody had to do that, right? He's the tragic person. So anyway, let's talk about, which one of these positions is the best.